did the American Revolution affect the fur trade? In the early 1600s, the British were some of the first Europeans to send people to settle permanently in the northeastern part of our country. Then, some 150 years later, the British American settlers, or colonists, wanted to form an independent country. Between 1775 and 1783, British troops fought against the colonial forces, the United States troops. This fighting became known as the American Revolution. When the colonial forces won, the British lost control of the colonies and the fur trade. The newly formed United States of America controlled both. The fight during the American Revolution had little effect on the fur trade in Wisconsin, however. Trading between the Indians, French, Métis, and British continued much as it had before. After the Revolution, the new U.S. leaders were busy setting up a federal government in Washington, D.C. They didn't send people to Wisconsin to stop the British from controlling the fur trade. The British were supposed to leave the trading post in Wisconsin by 1796, but some of them remained there. Because of the great distance between Washington, D.C. and Wisconsin, the new U.S. government could not force the British to leave. American control of the fur trade began after 1815, following the War of 1812. So, thinking about this section, ask yourself some of those key questions that you want to take some notes on here. And we're going to scroll to the next page and talk about the next war, the War of 1812, and how that impacted the fur trade a little bit differently. We're starting right here on the top. The American Revolution was not the last time British and U.S. troops fought each other. They fought again in the War of 1812. During this war, British troops asked some of the U.S. trading forts outside of Wisconsin to surrender. In 1814, United States troops quickly built a fort on Prairie du Chien. British forces demanded surrender of the fort, but the United States refused. The refusal started the only battle between the United States and the British in Wisconsin during this war. After 3 days of shooting, the United States surrendered the fort. By the following year, 1815, the war was over. Finally, the British agreed to leave Wisconsin. They either returned to Britain or moved to Canada and continued working in the fur trade. The Indians, French, and Métis fur traders once again adapted to work with the United States. So if we recap all that we've just read about all these wars, we had the French and Indian War, in which it was the British fighting the French to figure out who would control the fur trade. And in that war, the French lost, and the British were the ones that ended up taking over the fur trade. Then we have the American Revolution, right? And the United States says, British, we've had enough of you not only controlling our fur trade, but controlling us altogether. We want nothing to do with you. We want to form our own country now. Even though that war was won, the British were still in America. They were still feeling around and poking their noses in our business. So it wasn't until the War of 1812 where the new United States fought the British and eventually booted the British out, and they no longer controlled the fur trade, and the new United States of America controlled the fur trade. Now, keep in mind, through all of this, the Indians are still here. The Native Americans are still here trading. The French are still here trading, even though they don't have control, and the Métis are still here. So once again, as control goes from French to British to United States, all these groups have to adapt to these changes. So think about all this information and what were the big things that changed after these wars? What caused these wars? And what were some of those key events that happened? Type that in the box below. I'm not looking for complete sentences. I'm not looking for perfection. I'm just looking for you to take some of this information and kind of compare how these two wars were a little bit different when it came to the fur trade.